Monica Pinkston hefted her 150-pound rotary fire grenade cannon over her shoulder and sighed, surveying the smoldering wreckage of a building in which she had been imprisoned less than an hour ago. Smoke rose from its roof as the fires burned. Alarms blared in the distance. From the top of the hill, Monica had a good vantage point on the valley below. She knew she could shell the entire site right from where she stood and reduce it to so much vapor and ash. She knew that she could take great vengeance upon everyone inside, delivered through the barrels of 100 guns. There was a small, dying part of her that wanted to, but the rest of her didn't want to. Her heart had too many charred and broken corpses clinging to it already. She let go of her gun, and it fell back out of reality rather than to the ground. She turned her back on what remained of her prison and walked away. After half an hour of walking through rocky scree and dry trees, Monica realized she wasn't in Manhattan. She admonished herself for not stealing a car on the way out, or a helicopter. She sat down on the softest looking rock she could find and sighed. She had no survival skills, no equipment, no food, and no transportation. She had no idea where she was, and worst of all, she was nowhere near as alone as she wanted to be. There was something inside her. Now that her heart had slowed and her freedom was won, her mind started to work in the absence of more pressing matters. The echoes of the last hour reverberated through her, turning her bones to syrup. She fought back the urge to puke. 1 hour ago, Monica had been named D77777. This had made her somewhat noteworthy in the minuscule community which she had become accustomed. Lucky Sevens, they'd called her. Her natural tendency was to stay invisible, learned from a life of being hammered down like the lone nail whenever she stood out. But a computer somewhere had elected to make her inescapably noticeable, with 5 black 7s embedded on the orange of her back like so many fish hooks. So people naturally assumed that she had to be something interesting. The fate that had selected her to be something special, so they gravitated to her like moons around a planet. Monica was critically aware of how inaccurate all this was. She was a normal girl from a shitty neighborhood, too clever to be satisfied with what she had, but not clever enough to know when to stop. A long-standing petty criminal with daddy issues, mommy issues, money issues, anger issues, and plenty more. Just another stupid, regrettable sob story among millions in modern America. A crater left over from some teenage catastrophe. But no, for some reason, you could talk to Lucky Sevens. Sevens was quiet and would listen. Sevens gave good advice. Sevens was a quick study and knew how to survive. Sevens had made it through trial after trial without getting her face torn off, or her guts melted, or her brain sucked out. And she could probably show you how to do it too. Just stick with Sevens, and you'll be alright. This had all happened without her permission. But convincing the rest that she really wasn't a shit piece waste of skin wouldn't have made her anything better, so she kept her mouth shut and did her best. Then, the lab coats brought her here. They put that goo on her arm. Then, everything was different, all at once. Her body and her mind collapsed. She was no longer her own self. She had become a cup of her own soul being drunk by something very thirsty. And then, it had pissed her back out. This had happened over the course of a few seconds. Nothing told her explicitly that she'd gained enormous power, and that she needed to use that power to escape. The message didn't come in words. It was like smoke and iron filings in her blood. She felt things she never had learned the words for. The things that was using her body like a cheap apartment had taken something from her. She knew it. She didn't know what, but it was gone. Something was gone, and in its place had been left an arsenal. It had taken all of her frustration, all of her hatred, her misery and doubt, and blackened determination, everything that she was as a human person, and smelted it into a shape. That shape had hammered her life to pieces and defended the shards again and again. The shape that represented what she was to the world. The shape of a gun. She had thousands now, millions. Pistols, rifles, grenade launchers, howitzers, cruise missiles, and other things that the human animal had yet not been able to imagine. Great expanses of black powder, rivers of bullets and endless fields of firearms now rested in a space just behind her own life, and she had used them to escape. And they had tried to stop her. But every impact of their bullets upon her skin was just a hammer driving down the blasting cap of her soul. Her rage detonated against their need to keep her still, and they died trying to make it so. Her body had become a divine bomb, a celestial landmine. She understood none of it. She just acted. She had no time to see if anyone else could come with her. She had become too dangerous to be near, and so she was alone. But for the thing that had nestled deep within the superfluous folded meat of her body, the thing that spoke without speaking, the thing that told her to live as she needed. What Monica needed right now was a fucking cigarette. She patted for a second and found the few that she'd managed to smuggle into the compound. All but one was broken, but right now, one was enough. And then she realized that even with infinite firepower behind her eyes, she didn't have a fucking lighter. And then there was a blowtorch in her hand. She gave up. Apparently, life was now literally what she made of it. She smoked on the rock and wondered whether she was going to die. And then she heard a sound, the warm sound of an engine getting closer. She figured that made sense. She started with the element of surprise, but she hadn't killed everyone and hadn't destroyed everything. Now that they knew what to expect, they'd send their manhunters out, with better equipment and a better plan. They probably had snipers in the trees zeroing in on her right now. Monica put out her cigarette and stood, walking forward into the clearing. She didn't care about being seen. Given what had already happened, she had no reason to expect that they were capable of killing her anymore. Even if they could, it didn't matter. Monica had made the decision to die shooting before, and she had no issue with making it again. A black vehicle, some kind of dune buggy, fat tires, exposed metal skeleton, and there was only one person in it. She held her fire. Even after everything these people had put her through, Monica refused to shoot first. A man got out. He was tall, tan, military short hair, muscular, a paint-by-numbers cutout of every action movie protagonist ever, all in black body armor. He smiled in a way that made her want to hit him, and he held his hands up. Easy, I just want to talk. Monica's right arm became an enormous mechanized bastardization larger than her own body. She aimed its iron fist at him, and a barrel on the wrist glowed red-orange. The air hummed and thickened with exhaust from the pipes just jutting out of her shoulder. She replied, "Okay, I just want to vaporize your ass with this fucking laser, but I'll let you go first, jackboots. Talk." He kept his hands where they were. "I'm not trying to bring you back." Monica whistled. "Wow, that's pretty fucking smart, Heinrich, considering the situation and all." His smile faded. "I understand why you'd want to kill me. I'd probably want to kill me too. Do you believe in second chances, Miss Pinkston?" She showed him her teeth. "Fuck you." "I think you do. I've read your file. I know about most of the shit you've been through, where you come from, who's hurt you, and who you've hurt. And I have a pretty good idea of where you'd be if no one ever gave you another shot." She took a few steps forward and brought her titanic fist to within inches of his forehead. She could see the sweat on his skin, casting the molten light from the laser's aperture. "Telling me right now how much you know about my life is really bad for your health right now, you fascist motherfucker." He swallowed, but kept his eyes on hers. "Here's the deal. I'm only alive now because I've got the sense to stay on the winning side. I know what's going on out there. The Foundation is losing. I'm not a loser, and now neither are you. I have wheels, equipment, money, contacts, and information. You've been out of the system for years, Monica. Unless you want to make a monster out of yourself, you need my help. All you have to do is not shoot me." Monica looked into his eyes, blue and cold, and made a choice. The Queen of Spades, the Baroness of Old Vegas, watched as a floating blob of black plasma dissolved the mailbox a few feet from her head. She rolled away from the growling, glittering slime and stood, directing the row of artillery cannons behind her to fire upon the scrawny dickhead at the end of the street. The huge guns rattled the pavement and spat their shells down the block. A pseudopod of shiny black slime flicked up from the pool, devouring the ground, and swallowed them, erasing the explosive shots as though they had never existed. Monica said, "Why does this little shithead have to show up every time we get this zone clear? It's like he's got nothing better to do. Motherfucker needs a hobby." Jake said through her earpiece, "Beats me. We'd all prefer if you killed him, I think. I know Dozer's getting tired of repaving the roads." Monica dismissed the artillery cannons and summoned a battery of 6 surface-to-surface missile packs. She fired them all simultaneously, sending no less than 120 high-explosive missiles shrieking through the air towards the irritating freak. "Why don't you tell Dozer that he can drag his fat ass out here and he can try and earthbend this fuckhole into an early grave himself then, huh?" 119 of the missiles were swallowed out of reality by writhing tentacles of black sludge, but one of them found its mark. The pale man wrapped himself in an orb of the dark gunk to shield himself from the fire, and the rest of the stuff began to retreat, leaving carved furrows in the ground where it had been. Jake replied, "Got him! Press the advantage!" The Queen was starting to sweat. She was reaching the mass limit. Enough was enough. No more evacuated districts, no more scared families. This fucker had to die. Part of her was going to miss him. The perfectly black sludge, with its somehow distantly sparkling stars, was almost pretty, if you ignored the fact that it effortlessly devoured everything it touched. The black orb at the end of the street gathered itself up and hurled more levitating globs at her. They traveled slowly, quietly, obliterating traffic lights, lamp posts, and fire hydrants as they advanced. Monica extended a hand toward the sky and moved nowhere, calling down her coup de grace. The air above the intruder retched in a way that was horrible to look at, and a thunderclap cracked the sidewalks as a colossal tower of churning metal appeared in the sky. It blocked out the sun, howling and smoking and torturing the air with its heat. The bottom end was a hovering citadel of dark iron glowing with a ferocious white-orange, dripping molten metal, which fell 100 feet and splashed to the blacktop. The enormous machine was barely able to contain its own energy, so she let it out. A deafening hum rang through the city like a chime of the great bell as a column of space below the orbital cannon transformed into a line of orange light. It punched into the earth and obscured everything from view, blinding and terrible, vaporizing everything in its path. Hot wind poured away from the laser and washed over Monica, searing her invisible flesh that was in a way tantamount to the orgasmic. This was destruction. This was the fire of the gods. Then it stopped. The light disappeared, and with it went the showstopper, the pale freak, and all of his miserable hungry slime, leaving only a smoking molten shaft in the ground where he had been. Monica swayed, mumbled, "I think I got him," and then promptly passed out. She awoke in stages. Her entire body felt like it had been punched by one big fist, and her brain was full of rubber cement. There was someone near her, so she mumbled, "What happened?" Jake's smile was above her. "Morning, Your Majesty. You pulled the showstopper on Void Boy. I'm not sure if he was able to teleport away before getting melted. Dozer's mad at you, though. Apparently you punched through to the buried sewer main." Monica sat up, blinking. "Dozer can suck my dick." Jake laughed. "I'll pass that along. How do you feel?" She blinked some more and looked around. She was in the Oasis Treatment Center in a private room. Dim lights, bad walls, no decorations, but the equipment worked. There was electricity. And she had hired actual doctors that were willing to do the work in Old Vegas, despite the inherent danger. "I feel like one big bruise. My head hurts. Can I have some water?" Jake handed her a glass from a nearby counter and she drank greedily. She set the glass down and went silent, looking at her hands. The large man frowned. "Is there something wrong?" Monica shook her head. "No, not really. It's just strange." "What's strange?" She smiled. "A year ago, you were a site security captain for the fucking Foundation, and I was one of your prisoners. Now I'm some kind of bullshit wizard mutant, de facto brute force mayor of Las Vegas, and you're running an entire town while keeping my dumb ass alive. And we fight supervillains." "No, you fight supervillains. I stay very far away from the supervillains and give you occasional advice." She nodded absently and stretched. "Speaking of which, did you learn anything useful yesterday and about the whatever?" He made an apologetic expression. "No, turned out to be a dead end. Guy only had level 2 security clearance when he left." "I don't know what that means." "There's 5 levels. The higher your clearance, the more you're allowed to know. I was level 3 and only ever got hints and heavily redacted reports. So a level 2 guy isn't going to know anything we don't already know." "Okay, what'd you do with him?" "I offered him an apartment in the wreck. He looked at me like I was a giant spider and he said he'd rather take his chances in the desert." Monica scoffed. "Some people just don't want help." "I think some people don't want to live in the ruins of a city, populated almost entirely by mutants and mutant sympathizers." "The nerve! We even have running water sometimes, and we're really nice people." "No, I'm really nice people. You're a big meanie." The Queen of Spades gasped. "You take that back." "Nope. Come on, let's get some food in you, champ." They walked away together, one silently in love, the other glad to be alive. Monica had accepted the role of totalitarian ruler foisted upon her by the citizenry, but she staunchly refused many of the expected perks that went with it. She insisted on taking her meals in the Oasis cafeteria with everyone else, and tried to eat with different people every time. The dining hall obeyed the same rules as any other communal mealtime location. There were cliques, and segregation was common. There was no posted ordinance about requiring mutants and non-mutants to stay separate, but they often did regardless. Human nature continued to assert itself. The Queen stood at the end of the hall with her tray in her hand and looked around. Jake had left to attend to some business, and so she had decided who she was going to eat with today. Near her was Dozer, the burly, bearded construction worker who had received the most fitting mutation she had ever heard of. He used his earth-moving power to dig out the ruins, shift debris, and lay fresh pavement and concrete. Without him and his building crew, Old Vegas would have collapsed months ago. He sat with his workers and laughed heartily at a joke someone told. He had egg in his beard, but no one told him, because the maintenance men thought that kind of thing was hilarious. Another table further down was occupied by the Spookies, a small group of like-minded men and women with an array of strange mutations that made them stealthy or quick. Monica had made them scouts and spies, and they did the job with quiet efficiency. One kept fading in and out of sight, having yet to learn how to control her invisibility. Another was also hard to see. He kept himself wreathed in dense shadows to cope with his social anxiety. A third had a great number of multicolored eyes placed all throughout her face, and they twitched frequently, able to see through walls for miles in all directions. They engaged in hushed conversation, choosing to keep their secrets from all but their queen. And again, further along were the fighters, the few mutants with destructive powers rivaling Monica's own. There were maybe 9 of them, and while they were decent enough people, most of the others were at least a little afraid of them. One had been mutated to be utterly enormous, over 9 feet tall, with cherry red skin and large tusks. He had taken the nickname Ogre, but was known to be a sweetheart despite his fearsome appearance. Another had thorns and leafy branches growing from her skin. She was perilously poisonous, and Monica had once seen her regenerate from being blown to pieces by an anti-tank rocket. She wore pads on every exposed inch of skin to accidentally avoid embedding anyone. A third had glowing blue veins under his skin, was doing tricks for the others' amusement, making the silverware dance in the air with electromagnetism. He was capable of producing terrifying amounts of electricity, and had once supplied an entire district when a generator bank had gone down. And one table, all the way down at the end, was occupied by a loner. Norman. Norman's mutations were among the most dramatic that Monica had ever seen. He was a confusing, borderline, terrifying mess, a disgusting amalgamation of flesh and exposed organs which levitated in the air, orbited by dozens of lazily floating disembodied hands, each with an eye in the palm. Parts of him constantly warped in and out of visible space, appearing and reappearing. Multiple copies of himself as he looked before his mutation also made occasional appearance, popping into space and then fading away. Echoes of his former self, which he used to sit at the table and take bites of his meal, while his huge main body hovered, ominous and frightening, over the table. Just looking at Norman for too long gave most people a headache. Their minds recoiled at his very existence. People left him alone, unsure of how to approach him, much less engage him in conversation. Some had tried, but found it hard to eat with an undifferentiated, pulsating mass of human flesh literally looming over their heads. He only ate in the cafeteria a few times a month, teleporting into the room suddenly and then warping away when his meal was finished. Monica had no idea where he went or where he stayed when he wasn't around. He had only been coming to the Oasis for a few months. He and Monica had been imprisoned at the same site, and she remembered him as being a quiet, contemplative kind of guy before his transformation. And she was sure that supposedly held true still, but she wasn't sure. She felt horribly for him, and made it a point as mayor to eat with him whenever he was around. She approached the table, into the outer orbit of floating hands, some of which turned to look at her with their many-colored eyes. None touched her as she came closer. They simply disappeared before coming into contact. She placed her tray directly in front of one of his fuzzy, out-of-focus clones and sat, looked at it directly in his eyes. "How are you today, Norm?" There was a brief silence, and the clone's vacant eyes looked at hers without looking into them, and Monica felt a strange pulse move through her body. I'm all right. The wind is rich and full of secrets today. I saw you fight the void thrower. Norman's voice, if it could be called that, was difficult on the ears. He spoke with many voices at once, and sometimes conveyed meanings by directly injecting images or sensations into others' minds when words weren't enough. It was a profoundly surreal and sometimes upsetting experience, but Monica had gotten used to it. She did her best to keep her composure and nodded, keeping her eyes on her tray to avoid looking at the dead-eyed clone in front of her. Its mouth didn't move when Norman spoke. "Yeah, I'm not sure if he'll come back this time. I went the extra mile." You didn't kill him. I was nearby. I tried to hold him down when you fired your razor, but he escaped. He is very strong. This was unprecedented. Norman didn't make a habit of involving himself directly in life in Old Vegas, much less participate in the fighting. "Do you know anything about him? Who he is? Where he came from? And more importantly, why he keeps trying to murder everyone?" The clone disappeared abruptly, and then reappeared on her right with its tray in tow. It continued eating. A second one also materialized at the far end of the table, apparently not doing anything. He has a strange mind, few cohesive thoughts, a great amount of darkness, hard to find information in the shadows and dread. He appears only to murder and destruction. I'm not sure he's alone in himself. Monica raised an eyebrow and set around a mouthful of egg. Not alone. What do you mean?
I mean that he might not be the only inhabitant of his body. I think his mutation opened some kind of gate, and something came through. Something mean. But I don't know for sure. It's just a theory. I would have to get closer to deeper into him. And that would probably be bad for my health.
Do you think he can be killed? I think I'd like to kill him, considering he keeps trying to kill us.
I think you would need something to gum up the space around him, to stop him from warping away. I can do that, but not powerful enough to hold him. I would need help from someone else. I don't know anyone with the same kind of magic.
Monica nodded, frowning in thought. Neither do I. You know, the more I hang out with you, the more I like you, Norman. You're a nice guy, even if you are kind of terrifying. There was a sound of laughter, made echoing and awful by Norman's many voices, but he made up for it with an image of sunshine and happy, colorful flowers, and the feeling of a pleasant warmth, which he shoved directly into her mind without her permission.
I am a lovely bastard, but I prefer to think I make up my glowing and handsome personality.
A thought occurred to her she ate. You can just totally look through all of my brain, can't you, Norman? It wasn't a question.
Yes, it's not something I do on purpose. Imagine walking to a museum and being told that if you think about looking at the beautiful painting, you'll be punished.
That really doesn't help with the creepiness, Norman. Heavy gray clouds gathered in her mind, and a sad, soft rain began to fall. There was the sound of distant crying and the fluttering of wings.
I'm sorry, Monica. I can't help what I am. If it makes you feel better, your secrets are safe with me. If I had lips, they'd be sealed.
She shook her head. No, Norm, it's fine. You're fine. You just take a little getting used to is all. You probably understand that way better than we do. The rain continued and didn't stop.
It's hard. I was given great gifts, but a lot of things were taken from me too. I would never go back to what I was. But sometimes I think I would give almost anything to...
The words didn't come, but Monica knew what he meant. She had no choice but to know. You should come around more often, Norm. You don't have to stay away and be a stranger. You've got it worse than the rest of us, but we're all changed too. And we can empathize at least a little bit. You're valuable, not just a tactical asset, but as a person. You don't have to be alone. You have a family right here. You just have to give us a chance. A spear of sunlight stabbed through the clouds in Monica's mind, and there was the smell of fresh wind and the sound of proudly rustling trees.
That makes you feel better. You are who you are for a reason, Monica, and so am I. But it is good to know that of all people, you were given what you were given.
Norman froze. Every part of him stopped abruptly. No pulsing, no drifting, no phasing. Perfect stillness. He was silent. Monica opened her mouth to ask him what was wrong, but he interrupted her. Lightning crashed in her head. Images of terror, agony, chaos flickered through her vision uncontrollably. His voice was as loud as thunder, exploding through the minds of everyone in the oasis simultaneously. The cool blue glow that Norman gave became tortured and red.
Soldiers, hundreds, entering from the west district, from the western gate. Guns, armor, war machines. It is the foundation. They've come for us. Their commander intends to capture the citizens of Old Vegas and kill all who resist. We must defend. We must defend our home. Now!
The cafeteria immediately began to swarm with activity. Voices cried out. There was confusion and growing panic as Norman spoke directly to her.
I will provide a telepathic communications network. Instruct your defenders to think through me. I will access the field, the mind of the enemy. But first, I will banish their helicopters from my sky. Be strong, my queen. Lead us to victory.
And then Norman disappeared. Monica slammed her fists on the table and stood. The room immediately fell silent to hear her words. All fighters to your battle stations. Team captains, use Norman to coordinate with your troops and muster all defenders of the Western Gate. Maintenance squadron, dig in 200 yards back from 55th Street and break the road. Stop those fucking tanks. Spookies, get out there and get eyes on the intruders. I want status reports every 10 fucking minutes. Combat squadron, let's get the fuck topside into phalanx formation. No more drills, people. Let's show those limp dick fascist shit fucks you can't fuck with old Vegas. The room exploded in a roar of defiance, loud enough to rattle the concrete and quake the hearts of the Foundation. Monica stood at the end of 55th Street and watched as the Foundation troops flowed in, taking attack formations. They held their fire. Behind her, she had summoned a thick hedgerow of artillery cannons, squared up to the soldiers in black. They outnumbered the old Vegas defenders 3-1. They stood in lines in thick armor and gas masks. Their tanks, heavy and armored, idled at the end of the block, unable to traverse the wide cracks in the pavement put there by Dozer and his engineers. Their commander, a tall man with no mask, spoke aloud.
Attention all mutants and mutant sympathizers. It is with a heavy heart that we come to you today. The Foundation cannot allow the inhuman infestation to continue to spread. For the benefit of all humanity, we ask that all mutants present lay down their arms and surrender to be contained for their own safety and that of the safety of the world. I imagine I do not need to explain to you what will happen if you choose to resist. Please, for the good of us all, do the right thing and let this go.
The Queen of Spades, the mayor of Old Vegas, stood at the fore, her people behind her. Dozer, his body coated in a layer of shifting, flowing stone, cracked his huge fist together loudly. His engineers shouted, rattling the earth under their feet. Ogre roared and swung his enormous steel club into the ground, splintering the pavement. The mutant defenders behind his red bolt cried out with him. Norman hovered, eldritch and horrible above them all, gazing downward with his hundreds of eyes, feeding the Queen the commander's innermost plans as he thought them and providing the defenders the most profound unity of being able to think with one mind. And Jake was just behind her, quiet, calculating, his assault rifle trained directly upon the Foundation commander's head. Monica cried out, letting Norman broadcast her words directly into the minds of the Foundation soldiers. We will never submit to your tyranny. We are different, but we are still people, and we will die for the right to remain free. Come, bring me your hate. Bring me your conquest. Push upon us, enemies of liberty, and you shall know our defiance. We will turn you back. We are the free state of Vegas, and we will not be moved. The free men and women thundered their pride, their yearning to live, their right to thrive, and stood upon their ground. And Monica let herself be wielded by the heart of her people, her soul forged into the shape of the tool they needed to defend their homes and lives from those who would take them. The shape of a gun. The O5 Council sat in silence at what they had just heard. Finally, Four's gentle voice broke the reverie. What did you say? I said it was hopeless. Four watched the weathered old man slump into his chair. You're the last person I expect to hear that from, 10. Look at the data. The orange zone has shrunk by 2%. We've lost 2 sites worth of personnel and skips in the last month alone. Before he could continue, a blip on 11's screen borrowed her attention. She rubbed her temple. 2 more task forces are lost. Ada 5 and Phi 2. 1 rose slightly. Are they dead? Ada 5 suffered catastrophic losses against a 3396 empowered living mountain range. No further details. And Phi 2? A pause too long. 1 member dead, the rest defected. Shit. 2 spoke up finally. We need to beef up Alabaster. Every drop of resources goes into containment or neutralization if possible. 3 joined in. I don't like this. This isn't us anymore. Putting most of mankind in camps and labs is overstepping our place. 2 cocked his head. You picked a really bad time to suddenly grow a heart, 3. It's just containment of anomalies. That's what we do. That's what we've been doing. Nothing has changed except the scale and the budget. There won't be a mankind unless we do our jobs and do them now. 4 shifted. A formal vote then. For or against increasing the scope of Project Alabaster and making containment and neutralization of the 3396 spread the primary Foundation mission directive. A handful of voices quietly said, in favor, one after the other. 3, 4, and 8 voted to oppose. The remainder stood silently as history marched forward. 052 disconnected from the holographic call and returned to his favorite chair. Not that his current residence had much of a view. 13 bunkers were located around, inside it, or near the planet, each one containing someone who at one point would have been rightly called a king or queen of the world. One of these bunkers contained 05-2, designed by the Foundation's best and brightest, bristling with the most advanced technology on the planet. The fortress is located a kilometer beneath the desert sands of somewhere redacted. A titanic block of concrete and various named and unnamed metals, all protecting a singular room, a heart where 052 resided. The fortress defied any earthquake, hurricane, or asteroid that dared to try to reach him, but right now, it had a huge hole in it. Alarms blared all over the labyrinthine circulatory system of corridors. Classified machines bent the very fabric of space within the fortress to confuse and disorient any would-be intruders, as well as protect from outside disasters. One could walk for 100 kilometers and never get any closer to the heart if they didn't know the way. The flashing cognito hazardous emergency lights looked down upon miles of destroyed corridors. Massive guns lay destroyed, smoke still flowing from their shattered and melted barrels. Several humanoid bodies lay here, torn apart. One indistinct melted red corpse had its fist embedded within the broken remains of a Scranton Reality disruptor. The air around it sputtered and rippled with the machine's dying breaths as the corpse's skeleton twitched. What was once a laser defense grid whirred quietly, sparks dripping from it like tears. A motionless body made of sparkling crystal lay in pieces before it, and the deadly beams had left their mark on both it and the surrounding walls and guns. Deeper still, the walls were torn apart and corroded. One wall had been chewed to pieces by a swarm of fiery moths. Another had been turned to rock candy and shattered. Further into the complex, the more esoteric the defenses, and the more strangely they had been overcome, a turret was being chewed up by a Tyrannosaurus Rex made of plasma. A body most certainly did not lie crumpled in a 10-meter circle where reality was crushed flat to 2 dimensions and then rolled up into non-existence. A missile the size of a person sat in the air, encased in bone. A defense drone melted in a puddle of cheese. The Scranton Reality Anchors had sat quietly and impotently along the walls the entire time, for an anchor can hold a boat in place, but it can't stop it from sinking. Alarms kept blaring. Agent Palinez ran one last diagnostic check on a Cigarro's suit and activated all systems. They would be here any second. 052 was in a Saguaro suit of his own. If it was the last wall to be protecting him, there were far worse options than metal, polymer, and the redacted stuffed shell, powered by a black-boxed skip and an AI AD to move it faster than he could think, and a whole lot of hope. The only problem, that his suit was still powering up. Agent Palinez had always been a man of few words. Secure. Agent Figueroa continued. Contain. 052 felt the chill down his spine. Protect. Get behind us, sir. Palinez moved quickly and generated a force field seconds before a gigantic column of burning acetylene erupted from one of the attacker's hands. One instance of 2 arms holding 2 more disembodied arms made of brass led the charge of about 25 mutants. The 2 bodyguards braced. Their suits were experimental and only superficially tested. Still, they had a job to do. Agent Figueroa stepped forward and went on the offensive. She let loose a pulse of energy that threw the first wave back and gave her a second to breathe, before shooting a gray-skinned 2-headed man in the chest with her laser. One mutant extended its veins and arteries, which now ended in sharp points, and began to pry at the armor plating while another attempted to distract Figueroa with blasts of magma. A burst of electricity from the suit shot into the veins of the mutant, but the mutant held its ground, screaming. Another mutant, with only mouths on its face and neck, opened all of them to scream at Figueroa. She dodged more magma and then swung the vein guy into the path of the devastating sonic waves, disintegrating him. The scales of armor he'd managed to scrape loose fell off as well. Just gotta hold on. Palinez wasn't holding on as well. After narrowly escaping another plasma Dakota Raptor and dispatching it with a magnetic field generator, one older man had affixed both of Palinez's feet to the floor with an ultra-strong pink adhesive gunk and was currently attempting to dissolve the armor with acid while 2 more mutants held Palinez. Palinez had diverted power to his right leg and moved it, ripping up a piece of the floor along with it. Off guard, the chemical mutant was sliced in half by Palinez's energy blade, but his job was done. Rita grit her teeth. Now or never. Seconds ago, she just watched Ernesto die, giving her the opening she needed. She stayed behind Dylan and his rapidly breaking stone wall, and extended a single hair from her arm. The hair grew in length and stretched out past the rock wall, past Ernesto's remains, past David, desperately absorbing the armored man's blasts, toward the millimeter-wide breach in the suit. It then entered the gap and weaved its way past the layers and cracks, past the carbon-woven undersuit, right down to the agent's skin. Rita's single black hair touched a brown one on the agent's arm, and her eyes widened. In her mind, she spoke the word that she had felt when the blessed goo had raised her up, the word etched onto the DNA of every part of her cell. Thrive. Then a shudder that pulsed through his entire body. Every one of his hairs stood on end, and they wouldn't sit back down. The hairs grew longer and longer. Some doubled back onto his skin, creating new follicles that instantly sprouted even more hair. The hair filled the suit, and the pressure began to crush him. His ears and nose hairs had nowhere else to go. He could feel himself suffocating. A bad hair day indeed. Exhausted, Rita fell to the floor as Palinez asphyxiated. His heart finally stopped, and the suit systems executed one last command. The outer shell fragmented, and the pieces shot out at twice the speed of sound, as the rest of it exploded, turning a 6-meter radius, including Rita, David, and Dylan, into nothing but atoms and light. Armando clenched his fists, all 12 of the ones he had active right now. The blessed blue-green gift had merged with his original anomaly and pushed him far beyond whatever he thought he could be. After spending so many years in a containment cell, he was finally in control of his anomaly, and soon he'd be in control of his own destiny as well, when the foundation that had imprisoned him was gone. The second guard was more vicious. She had just torn one of them in half, and then nullified a retaliatory swarm of electricity wasps. Rita's down. Ernesto's down. We're gonna have to tear the whole thing open to kill her. Armando tore off an arm made of solid heptonitrocubane. Using several more arms in a chain, he hooked the dangerously explosive arm around the agent's neck. The explosion threw the remaining mutants back and filled the room with smoke. One mutant clapped his hands and the smoke coalesced into black metal needles, which converged upon the agent. She flung them away into another mutant, and then activated the artificial gravity generator, bringing everyone else to their knees. It took a pretty big chunk of power, but Figueroa deemed it worth the chances to pick them off. She moved toward one gold-skinned woman, who shielded herself from the scaly man next to her under a glowing force bubble resembling a tumbleweed. Figueroa knew it would take too much time to break the shield. She cranked up the gravity near those two for a split second, crushing them. Graviton generator shutting down. Shit. The outer shell wouldn't hold much longer. That last explosion had managed to crack it, and the magma earlier disrupted the polymer gel. The lowest layer of Genesis Weave was overworking, trying to repair itself fast enough to cushion the blows. And with her partner down, and the O5 suit at only 61%, she'd have to improvise. 3 of them remained: Armando, Angela, and Eric. They could see the breaches in the remaining guard's armor. If they could take her out, they could crack open the O5 suit like an egg at their leisure. Easier said than done, of course, but desperation was one hell of a drug. Armando and Eric rushed the guard, who responded with a sonic pulse. Armando quickly ripped the arm off and grew a wing of an extinct anomalous bat that negated the sound. Eric jumped high, and Armando grabbed his leg with 3 more arms and swung him downward at the guard, who extended her right arm into a shield. Eric increased his mass 100-fold at the moment of impact, smashing the shield and throwing the guard to the floor. Not giving her a chance to respond, Armando pinned her to the ground with 17 heavy metallic arms, while Eric hammered away at the armored plating with ultra-dense fists. Shell integrity critical. The Genesis Weave began to give. The power systems were shorting out left and right. Figueroa was sure she had cracked a rib or two now. She had activated the magnetic repulsor field and sent the arms holding her flying away. She charged one last shot of her psychic amplifier and liquefied Eric's brain before her left wrist erupted in a shower of sparks. Armando slammed a Brachiosaurus front leg into her face, which she managed to block, then fired 2 energy balls right into Angela's face and stomach without missing a beat. Armando grabbed her with several long octopus-like tentacles, but Figueroa let out a charged shockwave from her central power core that sent him flying. He hit the wall and managed to tear off some of the armor with the tentacle suckers. Armando summoned more math than he'd ever used and grew an arm with a nanometer-thick neutron star skin. He couldn't maintain it for long, but he was desperate now. The gravity overwhelmed Figueroa and pulled her towards Armando, and he slammed her into the midsection, sending cracks spiraling through the rest of the suit and breaking her faceplate. Figueroa didn't care that her face was exposed now. She had this in the bag. She reached to her side and threw her only null grenade, the gravity of the arm directing it. Armando ripped off the arm and threw it as hard as he could toward her. Figueroa flinched as the grenade erupted into absolute nothingness, leaving an empty void of reality right in front of her face where the arm was. She then diverted power to her palm cannons, her wrists held together as a ball of blue plasma glowed in her hands. She then extended her arms to fire the beam at Armando. He frantically generated arms as fast as he could to block the brunt of the beam, but Figueroa kept walking toward him. Then, she stopped. The beam flickered and then cut out. Figueroa gave one single cry of pain, followed by silence, as her right arm and face turned into translucent crystal. Armando turned his head and saw Angela, barely breathing, straining to keep 3 of her good eyes open, and holding the 4th bloody, disembodied eye in her own hand. The gaze of all 4 of her eyes turned whatever she was looking at into salt. As long as she kept them focused intently on the same thing, the suit shifted, repairing the transmutation almost as soon as it happened, but Figueroa was done for. Her heart crystallized, and the suit exploded. Less forcefully this time. Angela dropped the eye and collapsed, finally succumbing to the gaping hole in her body. 052's suit unfolded, as it was programmed to do upon the destruction of the other 2. Better to fight at less than 100% than to be a sitting duck, as they had reasoned. Armando spat blood and put up a dozen more fists. Sudden death, winner take all? Armando stood over 052, who was gasping at the shattered remains of his suit. Where's your power now? 052 coughed up blood. Was it worth it? All the lives you threw away to get here. Armando narrowed his eyes. That's real rich coming from you. Every single one of us volunteered. We knew what we were doing, and we all decided the reward was worth it. And what reward would that be? A brand new world, where there's a place for us that's not a cell. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a place in our world for you. Armando had more hands than anyone, but it only took one for him to strangle the man. Another crack in the foundations of the old world, hewn by the dead citizens of the new. Apotheosis Part 3. Thrive. This was it. No more f***ing around. The squad clanked behind him, battlesuit shimmering in the desert heat. SCP-3396 hung overhead, a second moon trailing a net of glowing blue across the horizon. Ahead, 3731 poured out of the hotels lining the boulevard. Prime Ghost Throwers. Spectral Emulsifier was too clunky for voice command. Gears ratcheted up and down the left arms of their suits. The Ghost Thrower's battery was powered by a human heart built into the exoskeleton somewhere, its pounding mixed with Garrett's own, drumming wildly at his temples. He swallowed, tasting sweat on his lips. The blues were closing in. The suit beeped as it shot him up with something that made sharp warmth ooze through his body. Loudspeakers on. You still have a chance to cooperate. Go home and wait for... A woman with bone spears jutting through the tiger fur over her skin leapt at him, snarling. He leapt back, boosters firing on the legs of his suit. A rifle popped to his left and lightning struck her out of the air. All hell broke loose. Mang's rifle spat round after round, bolts cracking down from the sky wherever they hit. The rest of the squad opened up, beams and waves ripping through space alongside bullets and grenades. A person-shaped hole in space bulged and stretched toward their formation, and Garrett twisted his hand in its gauntlet. The stream burst from the nozzle with a sound like a chainsaw cutting through desperate wails. Faint blue light swirled with the pained faces washed over the attacking form, ripping away bits of the void surrounding it until blackened bones showed underneath, and the figure crumbled. An alarm chirped in his ears, bullets pinged off him. The suit held as he swept his arm to the right, arcing across half a dozen of them, a dense, shifting cloud of birds, a tall man in a suit with a knot of gears where his head should have been, a many-armed beast that seemed to be made of plush, and 3 that looked just like people, with guns. The hungry spirits devoured them all, bulbs bursting in the street's light as the remains collapsed. The squad had spread out to his left, falling in behind Gutierrez with his belt-fed rig. The barrels churned, but the machine made no sound, except for the tinkling of shells hitting the asphalt. Wherever he pointed it, though, the gnashing mouths bloomed and chewed themselves mercilessly. The crowd of 3731, now running, fell in swaths as the countless teeth devoured them from the inside. Tucson would be reclaimed in the name of humanity. High up in the clouds, Armando sat on a floating spiderweb of arms. He looked out at the shimmering orange and purple of the sunrise as the morning broke over the desert sky. About 200 helium-filled arms nestled against each other, locked in a complex, crossword puzzle-shaped kinetoglyph, keeping the whole structure stable. Armando had time to reflect up here. Arms he left down below with his companions would alert him to danger, but they had been quiet recently. The Foundation's pestering had grown more and more infrequent, though no one was naive enough to think they had completely given up. Armando tried to remember a time when the Foundation wasn't at the forefront of his mind. He went further and further back until a scared 15-year-old boy sat alone in a derelict garage, shaking. Stupid. Stupid! The fossilized pile of toolboxes, car parts, bicycle chains, and assorted junk had collapsed on him. His arm was stuck, possibly broken. Elbows didn't extend like that, he was pretty sure. He struggled to free himself. If he could just get his arm out, he could start pulling the pile back together, and then maybe no one would get mad. He wasn't bleeding anywhere, so at least he had that going for him. No blood. The rusty box shifted slightly. Okay. 1, 2, 3! He was free, sort of. The arm wasn't. Still no blood. Armando looked at the stump, growing and stretching into a new arm like toothpaste coming out of the tube. He vomited at the sight of the fresh new arm, its freckled red skin blending into his own brown skin at the shoulder. He threw food and toys and a picture of his family in a plastic grocery bag and he ran. And he didn't stop. He wasn't free, really, back then. He tried pulling the new arm off, crushing it, hacking it off. All it ever got him was a new arm and a little more desperation. The new arms felt foreign, gross, invasive. They weren't him. He couldn't even control them, just suggest what they should do. He barely felt anything through them, just vague sensations of heat and pressure. Every new one that appeared was a cruel surprise, and human arms of every color gave way to arms of metal and popcorn and wood. It took him a while to accustom himself. Every new day, he could move the arms a little faster, a little more delicately. Even so, they would twitch and jerk on occasion, as if being moved by someone or something else. After hundreds of attempts, he eventually lucked out and got 2 arms similar to his own skin, and buried the rest. He tried to live normally, or at least as normally as a runaway with no home or education could. He ended up falling in with the wrong crowd. As his mom would have said, they welcomed his arms, gave him a home, but he still wasn't free, just another tool in the toolbox. Though he decided a roof over his head was worth letting go of any imagined destiny. The stereotypical one last job went south. Bullets flew through the air. A weird purple fog filled the air, probably from the mystery candy catching fire. The buyer had apparently gotten spooked and ratted them out, hoping either corrupt cops or Los Milagros would kill them over the anomalous guns and drugs. Armando hid behind the stack of crates, trying to find an escape. He was not going to die like this. The black vans pulled up. Agents in all black tactical gear appeared and cleared the area. A stray grenade exploded near Armando, deafening him and shredding his right arm. He felt the cells regrowing. Not now, you damned arms. The agent shot the man who threw it, then approached Armando, whose new right arm was now made of tire rubber. The agent spoke into his comm, and Armando woke up in a concrete cell. He was definitely never free in the Foundation. Endless tests prodding and poking and pulling at his arms. Endless gray. Endless tasteless food. And neutral, muted, rehearsed lines from the researchers. He almost broke out. Once. He fought back against the people keeping him there, but he lost control. He didn't own the arms. He was a slave to them, a host, a victim of their unpredictability. The rush of a chance to escape weakened his hold on the monstrous arms. Their unpredictability killed an innocent and cut his escape short. What would he even do if he escaped, he then realized? That he could never truly be free. So he let them take him back, and there he stayed. Armando had learned the value of eavesdropping at a very young age. He saw fewer and fewer people working at the site, hushed communications, letters and numbers that meant nothing to him. Something 96, something TPK. The evacuation came soon after. Every SCP, every doctor, every janitor, every folder was picked up and thrown in the transports. He never got to see what the facility actually looked like from the outside. Sirens, followed by explosions. The truck holding the cells stopped abruptly, and then began to melt. The wall of Armando's chamber sparkled and then turned to salt, which cracked and crumbled and was blown away in the breeze. A four-eyed woman with translucent white hair and skin lowered her goggles and smiled. "Are you coming with us, or do you want us to drop you back off at that site?" He took her hand and walked toward his new future. The magical blue matter they had offered him had made him feel like he was being baptized. He was in control now. Every arm sang along with his soul. They moved like water at a single thought. He could feel the texture of reality through them. Whatever had been moving them before was either dead or had fled in fear at the blue-green that was now filling him. His new friends spoke of the future, of a new era dawning. The world had been dipped in this blue matter, they said. It was only a matter of time before it soaked through completely. Still not fully free, with the Foundation doing everything humanly and inhumanly possible to catch them, but Armando felt like he was finally on the right road. It had been almost 4 years since then. The great tree had awakened, and Armando had watched it rise and branch from his cloud perch. Even now, the beautiful fractal of blue and green could be seen off in the distance, stretching into the heavens. He exhaled and closed his eyes, feeling the breeze envelop him. Look at me, world. And for the first time in his life, Armando felt like he was truly, undeniably, free. It was calling them home. It was calling them to thrive. Tilda Moose and the collection of beings that were once Mobile Task Force Sigma-3 stepped out of the way, leaving the sanctuary of the library's halls. Once the land on which they stood was called Chicago. Now it was a desert of obsidian, with not a structure in sight. It was beautiful. It was empty. Moose considered going back one final time. There was nothing forcing them to do this, but curiosity is one of those things that had defined their life. If it defined their death, then so be it. The truth of humanity's nature, its purpose, lay just ahead. Moose could no more turn back than a drowned man could refuse air. The group began to rise into the air, half willing the action themselves and half being cradled by the force above. Moose dimly felt the impact as their physical body was ripped asunder by the detonation of the Foundation's final weapon. It was pathetic, really. Bathed in the light from above, they were so far above this now. The so-called true remnants of humanity had only harmed themselves. As they approached what they knew to be the source of their power, the old worries returned once again. Would they be enslaved to this being's will? Would their identities be stripped away and fused into a mockery of life? What was the catch? What was the price? "Why are you doing this?" they whispered with the lips of the ether, and they came to a bolt of understanding. Humanity was never the beneficiary, the purchaser of this power. This fate, this godhood, had been determined long ago by whatever forces had born humanity to begin with. And who were they? There was always another secret to learn, and now Moose had all the time in the multiverse to find the answer. 058 looked out at the burning Pacific Ocean and smiled sadly. An errant thematic wave had washed into the sea and had done something to its chemical structure, turned it into gasoline or something similar. From there, it had only been a matter of time. Heat was everywhere these days, after all. Literally, as it turned out, a stray flow of magma from a nearby tectonic shatter flowed past the 8th Overseer, coming within inches of his shoes. He felt nothing. The shoes weren't even real. He looked up and saw the mutants there, hovering in space and looking down at him, or at least looking down in his direction. He doubted any of them were paying enough attention to see him specifically. But they could see him, through the planet's thickening atmosphere, and he was very proud of that so many of them survived, in truth. It was all that he'd ever wanted. He'd considered himself lucky that so many had been saved to carry the species to new heights. Or distances, he supposed. Space was funny. He had spent so many thousands of years taking care of this absurd little species, watching them grow up, taking the first steps out of the oceans to live under the hot sun. If he was being honest with himself, he'd always been more partial to the ocean-going species, but in a surprising twist, they turned out to be less smart than the primates. Or way smarter, he guessed, looking at the senseless destruction all around him. It was hard to tell. But in time, he had grown to love them. He bore their sorrows upon his great shoulders so that they could keep going without being crushed. He watched from the depths they built their great cities and pushed the darkness back with their very breath. He had seen great promise in the Foundation since its inception, but was concerned at the outset that they were a touch zealous, useful, but after a while, necessary. An absolute requirement for human life to go on. 058 could have done the job on his own if he'd put his back into it, but he greatly appreciated the Foundation making his mighty burden less heavy over the years. So he chose to watch them, from the inside, to steer them in the right direction when he could without toppling them over. He realized now that he had failed hilariously in this pursuit, But thankfully it didn't matter anymore. For the first time, humanity was truly free. And that meant the thing that called itself Overseer 8 could finally let go of the weight it had carried for so long. So he did. And in that instant, he could hear the horrifying, unified roar of thousands of starving abominations across space, now immediately aware of Earth's existence. They began to tear through space like a machete through pudding toward the defenseless and exposed planet, intent on consuming this next meal in a long line of planets devoured that stretched back to the beginning of time. Are you sure this is how you want to play it? A woman materialized next to the Overseer in a wash of seawater that splashed upon the nearby lava and sent up clouds of steam. She was incomparably beautiful, clothed in corals and shells and seaweed, with hair as red as blood and skin of alabaster. She smiled in a way that failed to be anything other than predatory. She was the single most violent, barbaric, and disgusting thing that Overseer 8 was aware of, and she was also his sister. He replied, "Really? After all this time, you express doubt?" She laughed daintily. The Overseer heard it echo through the thousands of mindless creatures that lived behind her eyes, until it became a howling cacophony of bestial hunger. "No, dear, I have no doubts, merely surprised at your sudden laxity." He snorted and brushed some ash from the lapel of his charcoal suit. "I have no reason to keep holding you back. There aren't any more people for you to devour and enslave. If you haven't noticed already, you and your spawn are free to do as you wish. You have everything you've ever wanted. Freedom, a legion of fanatic servants that you've twisted beyond recognition, an entire cosmos to gnaw on. Go nuts, but I'd leave soon if I were you. There's some disagreeable things on the way, and they'll try to kill us if we're still here." She seemed pensive. Drawn by what, I wonder? The Overseer looked up. The last humans were gone. Us, I think. Or perhaps curious about an active and energetic planet appearing out of nowhere. Either way, they're coming, and not for polite conversation. She regarded him with an unconcealed curiosity. "But what will you do, my oh-so-serious brother? No more of your so-called innocence to keep safe from bad old me? No more foundation to prop up your shoulders? Are you going to guard the rocks now? You're doing a terrible job. I think most of them are on fire." He smiled and began to gather his essence around him. "I might actually. What's left of them anyhow? What purpose do I have now? I've been defined by death and pain and sacrifice for my entire existence. I spent millions of years trying to stop you from munching on the life that gave us our very reason to exist. I am the sorrow of all humanity. I am their pain, their endurance, and their memory, their mind and honor, the one who stopped them from being animals, who watched them and taught them, administered to their better nature while keeping them out of the things that wanted to eat them. Our elder brother in his wisdom had decided that their time had finally come. They don't need me anymore, and they don't need you either, if they ever did. They're beyond us now. What am I going to do, my dear? I'm going to do what I've always done. I'm going to endure. I will shoulder a burden most heavy." The Overseer pulled from the air a colossal anchor, as long as he was tall, covered in rust and barnacles, and twisting in nearby space with its sheer cosmic mass, the sum total weight of all of humanity's pains, sadness, and anguish, and determination to exist through it all, the burden they had left behind. It entered real space with a subtle boom that extinguished every fire in a 100-mile radius. He hefted the great weapon and laid it across his shoulder, where it had always belonged. He looked to the stars, where the ignoble predators from the far reaches of reality shrieked down toward them. "Will you join me?" The woman, the hunger, the lust, ferocity, and rage of what had been mankind grinned wide, showing teeth that had been bitten through continents and ages long since past. "This once, brother? I will. Let us teach them how to fear." And then she disappeared, an ocean of pale flesh rotting and shrieking, made of corpses of thousands of years of the planet's most furious dead, exploded from beneath the bedrock of North America. The avalanche of wrathful corruption ground its tendrils into the bones of the earth and yawned its many maws, reaching upward toward the sky in a desperate need of violence that gave it its heart. The man who was not the Foundation's 8th Overseer armored himself in plates of the purest stone, hewn from the agony and valor of Earth's most sacred and worthy dead. He gathered what remained of the planet's oceans around him and rose, the last night, at the eternal guardian and soul of humanity, ascended to fill his oath. And together, they waged their final war. 051 strode out of the ruins of his bunker, his face a mask of rage and grief. They had protected humanity for so long, Humanity was imperfect, it was chaotic, and it was the only thing he'd ever loved, and now he was finally alone. A truth that had been figurative for over 2,000 years was now literal. The irony was bile in his throat. He stared at the new blue star and let out a roar of frustration. He poured every sacrifice, every tragedy, every Montauk, and every victory into his voice. When he fell silent, little of him remained. I'd do it all again. All of it. 1,000 times over. Even if I knew I would still fail. He straightened up and began to pace. I see you in the sky, rising to a final betrayal with a being that is nothing more than a mockery of true life. You abandon everything your ancestors have built, everything we have shed blood to protect. I know this is the end. I can feel life itself leaving this world. But you had stood with us rather than against us. We could have won. We could have endured as we've always endured. Survived the way we always survived. But you were seduced by power. You may have become gods, but that is something less than human, not more. The present isn't worth the loss of the future and the past. 051 stopped and turned to face someone who wasn't there. Hello, Fritz. Did no one ever teach you it's rude to interrupt a soliloquy? Nobody said nothing. You always stood with us, but when I needed your guidance more than ever, you were gone. Why? Nobody still said nothing. We'll both be dead soon. Just tell me why. For the sake of everyone we've sacrificed on the altar of our ideals, tell me why you abandoned them. Joseph, it wasn't the greater good anymore. Neither being spoke again. The wanderer had ended his journey, and nobody was never no one. In low Earth orbit, an entity was still, watching with its many steel eyes. It glinted in the light of the faraway sun. Spires of dull, towering metal drifted in a cosmic wind, each with a glowing orange core, each the size of a small city. The constructs contained enough power to vaporize star systems. With one thought, the entity of the center of this grand iron cathedral could gaze upon light years of space and reduce into a hot slurry of base particles. Its cannons, reactors, generators, armor, and power were infinite in the truest sense of the word. It was a disparate network of machines floated in the void, orbiting around one locus. Nestled at the heart of this assembly of endlessly destructive engines was the form of a human woman, small and unimpressive, an afterthought, kept only out of a sense of vague respect for what the entity used to be. A nostalgic figurine, skin of pure elemental iron, the entity's favorite. A gentle fiery glow could be seen in the plates, a hint of a furnace at its heart. The small figure looked at its own hands and wondered. It was still known to itself as Monica. She more or less had lost her humanity completely. She was no longer a person and she knew it. Either that or the definition of humanity had changed forever. She kept her name and the memories of what she used to be. Her knowledge was as close to complete as it could have been, after devouring and integrating most of what used to be the internet and the secure databases of the erstwhile United States, but she found herself incapable of forgetting. And she didn't want to. There were others near her, the survivors who had ascended alongside her, who she had led to absolution. There was the thing once called itself Dozer. He and his engineers, who had always been fast friends, had elected to encase themselves in stone and fuse, becoming one mind. Now they formed a monolithic citadel of beautiful white and black statuary, with miles of carvings of people and houses and plants of bygone civilizations, which moved within the halls and spires as they drifted through the solar breeze with a life of their own. Memories of where they had come from, hewn from the rock and given new life, to stand for all time. Ogre and Violet were there as well. On their last day before leaving Earth, they had married and wove their essences together. Now they existed as a great menagerie of plants and animals across dozens of floating islands, with their own pockets of breathable air and gravity, and looked upon the lives they had saved with pride and affection, determined to find a place where Earth's treasured creatures could live anew. And then there was Norman. He was nameless now, a moon-sized mass of flesh swathed in a sea of luminous and rich blue-green water. A great leviathan's shapes could be seen moving under the waves of its surface, creatures of Norman's own design which had taken on a strange and alien existence of their own, his mind unreeled for light years in all directions, hunting for minds to discover and learn, relentless in his quest for learning and enlightenment. And there were many thousands of others, each with shapes incredible and unique, every one an expression of a human mind let loose from the constraints of mere possibility. Below these gods, the planet they had once called home burned and shuddered. Little life remained in the wake of the destruction that the Foundation had wrought. In their desire to remain the only true humans, They had cracked the continents with their bombs and boiled the seas in technological rage. The energies whirled, and all the while the blue simply existed, uncaring and unmoving in the face of all their wrath. The tree had grown until it was no longer a tree, became a sprawling ecosystem of its own, a huge network of glowing aquamarine tendrils that had sprouted and overtaken most of the western United States. And once the world began to burn, it left. It ascended into the sky, a massive aggregate of interwoven strands that glowed, indifferent to the suffering and destruction. It blossomed and writhed languidly in orbit of the ones that it had changed, reacting to nothing, simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Monica never had great love for the Foundation, but now understood what purpose they had served. They had chained back the thousands of humanity's unseen and immortal foes. They had been the bedrock upon which civilization rested. For so long, they had been the salvation itself, and she knew it was likely that without them, she would not exist. She supposed it was fitting then that they had decided to die upon it, finally being rendered obsolete. Humanity no longer needed them, and in their rage and their loss of purpose, they had chosen to self-immolate rather than go on. Before the end, she had spoken with some of them. She had become too powerful to threaten by that time, and wanted them to see reason. Surely eternity was worth letting go of some outdated principles and prejudices. Surely definition of what was anomalous no longer mattered. They could come to see that it was senseless to prolong such a futile struggle. But they spat in her face and chose fire instead. They would rather normalcy be absolute than live one more day sharing a planet with such unclean and aberrant monsters. And so Monica saved who chose to leave, and left them to their blaze of glory. For all intents and purposes, they had been humanity itself, but that no longer meant what it used to. The future was so much larger than a ball of rock ruined by those that chose to burn eternity to salvage the past. Out there was possibility, potential. The far bounds of reality failed to care that humanity yet existed, that they had come upon the cusp of their apotheosis. But Monica swore she would make them care. They would sear their sign upon the stars themselves. They would thrive and quake the pillars of creation with their advent. She shed one final tear, a droplet of molten metal that drifted into the expanse, a memento for those who had fallen into ignorance and pride and pointless strife. She signaled to her people, and they left Earth behind to seek their fate in the cosmos. Alone in its orbit, the blue, the Empyrean parasite, the ineffable creature of the secret inner fire that had been first among all of life, saw the results of its work were painted across eons, and this latest thread it had woven into the grand tapestry pleased it to no end. There had been such potential here, and now it was realized in full. It would need to be, to withstand what was to come. It laughed, a quiet sound that buckled the stars in their stride and twisted space into a paroxysm of primal joy, a victory well won. And it also left to see if the grand defenses of this reality were yet strong enough.